think the mouse might reach a reach.
Okay, great.
I'll just get it set up for you.
That's fine.
Whoops.
Thank you very much for inviting me to do this. I'm really pleased to be here. So I think while we're getting this set up, there we go. I will start with a very quick story. I have, about 15 to 20 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. Which is really about how I got to this, this topic of what I now call the Civic Empowerment Gap, and why I think it's really important for schools to pay attention to it. This occurred when I was teaching in the Boston Public Schools. Was it my first year? No, it was my third year in BPS. I was teaching 8th grade, and it was on September 11th, 2001, about a week into school, when I was teaching American history. We were looking at the Articles of Confederation, that favorite topic. You zoom through in a day or two. Government was too weak, let's move on. And a teacher from down the hall came and knocked at my door to ask if I knew what was going on. I said no, and so we went into her room because she had a little TV with these rabbit ears. And, it was very old school even in 2001. And we sat and we watched what was going on for about 45 minutes. And then we came back into my classroom. This was with the set of 8th graders who were my homeroom students. I had known them for about a week, max, in a week, because we start 2 days after Labor Day, so maybe 4 or 5 days. And they were totally baffled. Right, I mean, we were all baffled. But they were not only baffled as to who would do this and why they would do it and so forth, but they also, it turned out, really had a hard time understanding some of the basics. As we went through, it turned out that many of them didn't realize that Manhattan and New York City were not totally coextensive, but that Manhattan was part of New York City. And so when we talked about Manhattan, and we talked about New York, and we were talking about the World Trade Center, we actually meant the same thing. They didn't understand why the Pentagon was attacked because most of them didn't know what the Pentagon was. They had not heard of the Pentagon, or I mean, they sort of might know that it was part of government, but they didn't know why or what it stood for. Our school, I taught the McCormick Middle School, which is in Dorchester, right along Harbor Point next to UMass Boston, and we have a view basically of the plains, so the kids were really scared that we were a target. And so it was also interesting to try to help them sort of think about what kinds of symbols there are, and why something like the World Trade Center might have been targeted as a symbol of American commerce and power, and why something like the Pentagon would have been targeted as a symbol of America's military might, and why apparently, say, Congress, might have been targeted at the Capitol building as a symbol of America's political might, but that the McCormick Middle School in Boston, no matter how close we were to the airport, was just not going to be a target. So helping them actually sort of decenter their sense of importance in the world also was something we did. So we chatted through this stuff, and then talk inevitably turned to who might have done this and why. And one of my students, this is all still without any other adult influence. I'm the only adult, along with the teacher who invited us into her room, that the students have talked to up until this point. One of my students says, well, I know who did this. I was like, oh yeah? And he says, President Bush. And we said, excuse me? He said, President Bush did this because he wants to go to war. And I said, what? He wants to go to war with Iraq. And so he did this in order to give himself an excuse to go to war with Iraq. And I said, no. At this point, we thought 10,000, 12,000 Americans were probably killed. And I said, I don't care what you think of President Bush. I should say, I am no fan of President Bush. I wasn't then, I am not now. But I said, an American president is not going to willfully kill 10 or 12,000 Americans as an excuse to go to war with Iraq. And they said, no, Dr. Levinson, you're wrong. That, of course they would. And they started recounting other horrible things the presidents did. They owned slaves, they committed genocide against Native Americans, they done lots of pretty horrible things. But more to the point, many of my students argued, was that Saddam Hussein had dissed him and his father, had tried to assassinate his father, and also he had stolen, current President Bush had stolen the election. It was obvious he was sort of capable of anything. Why wouldn't he attack the World Trade Center and the Pentagon as a way of justifying war with Iraq? So my students were split on this. About half thought that this was a plausible account and half didn't. I, 10 years later, still think that that's an implausible account of what happened. I certainly think it's plausible to think, I think it's sort of patently obvious that Bush used the attacks as an excuse to go to war against Iraq, and it may even be that he had designs on Iraq in his mind before September 11th. I don't know about that. But I still refuse to believe that Bush had anything to do with planning or executing the attacks. Nor do I believe, had he known about the attacks in advance, that he would not have done everything he could have to stop them. And this is somebody who actually thinks that Bush should be prosecuted as a war criminal and spend the rest of his life behind bars, ideally. So I am not a Bush fan, but I think it is just wrong to think that Bush knew about or planned or executed these attacks. But that made me wonder, why did my students think that he was? And why did I, despite my fairly strong partisan views, feel that it was impossible to conceive that he could not? Especially when we had, if anything, I had greater historical knowledge than they. I had greater political knowledge than they, et cetera. But they, of course, had a lot of knowledge that they were drawing on, and a lot of knowledge they weren't, and there was a lot of knowledge they didn't have, such as what the Pentagon was, right? So in thinking about why I, as a white middle-class teacher in this school, reacted the way I did, and sort of drew upon evidence as I did to try to make sense of what was going on in the world around me. And my students, and the students in the Boston Public Schools, are predominantly non-white. The students at McCormick are about 50% immigrants or children of immigrants. They are uniformly poor. About 90% of the school qualify for free and reduced price lunch. In trying to make sense of how they made sense of the world around them and the political events around them is part of what led me to work on this book that's eventually become what I call No Citizen Left Behind. And this notion of the civic empowerment gap. I used to call it the civic achievement gap, but I think that that's actually the wrong formulation. I wanted to sort of frame it in comparison with the academic achievement gap, because as I'm going to argue, I think that schools have as great an obligation to address what I called the civic achievement gap, as they have finally taken responsibility for addressing the academic achievement gap. It is no longer considered acceptable that, say, black 12th graders on average read at the same level as white 8th graders. No longer in school circles and policy circles is it acceptable to say, well, you know, they just don't have as many books in their homes, the parents are working so hard, you know, whatever. That's just natural, that's going to happen, right? We hold schools to account for educating all children to a high level. They're not succeeding in many cases, but that is, I think, a legitimate expectation that we hold. We don't hold schools, though, to account for educating students civically to the same levels. And I'm going to say that I think that actually harms us as a democracy. It not only harms young people, the students who we are not serving, but it harms all of us. In part because what's interesting is when I tell this story about September 11th, its valence has changed massively over the last decade. Right? When I went home from school that day and told my husband this story, he and I both agreed that my students were crazy, right? I mean, that this was just clear, you know, wacko conspiracy thinking that was exactly like conspiracy thinking around the CIA spreading crack cocaine in the inner cities, or spreading AIDS, or all sorts of other wacko conspiracy theories that I sort of, you know, thought of as being held. And that sort of most of the people I would tell this story to, especially most white people I would tell this story to, had the same interpretation for a good year. By a few years in, right, that interpretation was not the same. Even those who, like me, considered this actually a misinterpretation of the facts, no longer think that this was wacky or just a sign of utter ignorance and misunderstanding about the basics of American government, American politics, et cetera. And so I think that there is something that therefore we as a society would be better off if in fact more voices had been heard from the beginning, right? If voices like my students, and remember they came up with this entire account on their own, including the references to the stolen election, et cetera. But if they, and presumably others within their communities, had more voice earlier on, we may, I don't know that we would have pursued a different policy, but there may have been greater scrutiny, there may have been greater conversation, greater attention, et cetera. So, but my students have very little civic power, in fact. And this is what I call the Civic Empowerment Gap. And let's just sort of go to some statistics for this. So I'm just going to throw out a definition of citizen so that we have one, not because I'm particularly strongly tied to this, but I've chosen this because I think it's fairly generic. So if we consider a competent and responsible citizen to satisfy these qualities of being informed and thoughtful, participating, having certain moral and civic virtues, such as caring about the public good, not just being rapacious and self-interested, say, and acting politically. I'm going to take this definition because I think it permits a lot of different ways to be a competent and responsible citizen. You can, run for office, you can boycott, you can engage in civil disobedience, you can vote. We're not really judging what kind of civic actions you take. I should say I have not included in this definition other ways of being citizens that may be useful. Foot dragging, blogging, creating art. Those may also be sort of ways of doing civic action. I'm not going to talk about those today, all right? But anything along this other range, from voting to volunteering to running to office to boycotting to protesting, et cetera, persuading others, all of that sort of will fall into my concept of what it means to be civic, and then when I talk about the civic empowerment gap, into measures of this gap. Right? So on that list, there were basically 4 key attributes. Good citizens needed to have some knowledge. They need to have certain kinds of skills. They need to have certain kinds of pro-civic attitudes, and then behaviors to actually participate in some way. We know that there's a really strong direct correlation among these. That political scientists, this is one thing that's actually robust in the literature, is that if you have knowledge and you have skills and you have certain pro-civic attitudes, you are much, much more likely to be engaged. And so if we care about civic engagement, and I haven't yet given you a good argument for why we should at schools, but if we do, then we would think that schools should actually work on promoting these things: civic knowledge, civic skills, civic attitudes, as well as civic practices. So we know that there is what I call a civic empowerment gap along all 4 of these dimensions. So to take knowledge and skills, studies of 4th graders, 8th graders, 12th graders in the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the so-called Nation's Report Card. There was an international study of 9th graders that had a large national sample in the US. There have been very good studies of adults. Uniformly, they show that whites and Asians and basically middle-class Americans do much better in terms of civic knowledge and skills than non-whites and non-Asians, and those who are not middle class, those who are poor. Sort of very uniformly, over time, over space, et cetera. So shifting to behaviors, we'll start with the voting rates, and I've started with the 2004 election, which you may consider surprising, since obviously we've had another presidential election since then. I should say I didn't realize we were I failed to pick up on the idea that this was Massachusetts-centric. I'm sorry. I would have focused on Massachusetts voting data if I paid attention to that, but this is national voting data. So this is the 2004 election. You can see humongous gaps, right? So that say whites and African Americans vote at about a third greater rate than, say, Hispanics and Asians. The natural born vote at a significantly higher rate than naturalized. Income is humongous. Level of education is just overwhelming, right? So if you have any amount of postgraduate education, you are actually more than twice as likely to have voted in the 2004 presidential election than if you have less than a high school degree. Now, watch these numbers as we go to the 2008 election. Beck, do you mind doing a back arrow and then a forward? So there's the 2004 election. There's the 2008 election. Right. The difference is negligible. Right. So for all of the, enthusiasm about the 2008 election and its historical nature, et cetera, you are still less than half as likely to have voted in that election if you did not graduate from high school than if you have any kind of postgraduate education. You are still almost half as likely to have voted if you are very poor than if you are middle class, right? And I don't see any reason to think the 2012 election is going to be any better, and of course the midterm elections are always worse, right? So that's, I think, a good example of the civic empowerment gap with respect to behaviors. We also have studies of all sorts of other kinds of behaviors that aren't just voting, right? Contacting elected officials, working for a campaign, affiliating with some kind of political organization, even protesting. And you might sort of imagine that if there is anything that, say, poor people might have an ability and an incentive to do more than middle class and wealthy people, it would be, say, to go out and protest or to contact a government official, right? Since usually you actually have greater need of services from the government potentially. But all of those are done at significantly higher rates by those who are middle class or wealthy. And there's also similar data about along lines of race and ethnicity. So moving to attitudes. So we've looked at knowledge and skills very briefly, at behaviors briefly, and now moving to attitudes. There is, again, an incredibly clear correlation in the research literature that a sense of efficacy, a belief that, say, people can make a difference if they get involved, that's political efficacy, a sense of personal efficacy, I can make a difference if I get involved, a sense of identity and duty, I should do this, I identify as Bostonian, as an American, whatever. These are highly positively correlated with political participation, and they are significantly negatively correlated with poverty, minority status, and immigrant status. So just one example here is an African-American Hurricane Katrina survivor who was giving testimony in New Orleans a few months after the hurricane, who sort of talks about this lack of identity, this feeling alienated, and as if his identity is not shared by others. And I think that this sort of plays out, say, these are surveys, again, 2 years after Hurricane Katrina, where blacks and whites, in this case, diverge just stunningly in terms of their beliefs about whether or not the government response to Hurricane Katrina would have been faster if the victims had been white, and whether or not it showed that racial inequality remains a major problem. I find these numbers just incredible in terms of just how different groups in the United States, again, read their political world, our political world, very, very differently. Regardless of what your belief is, where you align, it is just very, very clear that different groups in this country have very different experiences of what it means to live, grow up, and be a part of the political community here, and the civic community. So having very briefly shown that along knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviors, there are these significant disparities in who has greater of those things and who has lesser of those things that are very easily tracked by demographics, especially income and education level, also by race and ethnicity, and in fact by immigration status. The question is, well, why should we care, right? And as I was saying at the beginning, I actually think that it should matter to those of us who, say, are presumptively at the top of the civic empowerment gap, those of us who are currently the winners, who have sort of more power. One is, I think that it's a matter of legitimacy, right? I think that we have an illegitimate government when we know by looking at somebody whether or not they likely have political and civic power. That's just not what living in a democracy means. I think also, therefore, as a matter of stability, totally self-interestedly, if people believe that they have been excluded from, do not have a chance to participate in, do not have a chance to make a difference in their community through standard, legitimate, nonviolent means, I think as a matter of stability, eventually people are going to decide to go around the system, outside the system, right? So again, as a matter of self-interest, I think that we have some call for reducing the civic empowerment gap. It obviously is incredibly unequal, and it's undemocratic, right? So, and democracies, in fact, they are stronger when they have the input of a wider variety of people, right? When we hear the voices of more people with more experiences, we get more insights and are more likely to make better decisions than when we don't. And so in order actually to have a stronger, better democracy in which we make better decisions, I think we want to, in fact, eliminate the civic empowerment gap. We know that three things predict participation, and this is another way, in a certain way, of doing the knowledge, attitude, skills, etc. So resources. Do you have the skills to get involved? Do you have the time? Motivation. Do you believe you can make a difference? Is there an issue you care about? And then opportunities, specifically being invited. Having somebody say, come to this protest with me, come stuff envelopes with me, come vote with me, whatever. It's in all of this. I'm not saying that schools are the only site that is responsible for addressing the civic empowerment gap. That would be crazy and it would be foolhardy. But schools do matter. And they have potential impact in a whole variety of ways. First of all, as we saw, the overall educational level is in fact the strongest predictor of voting, and in fact many of these other things. But we also know that many of these other approaches and opportunities also have a huge impact on reducing the civic empowerment gap. They give kids the resources and the motivation. They offer them opportunities. Come do this with me. That then can play out over time. They help them build the knowledge and the skills and the efficacious attitudes and the sense of identity that will help reduce the civic empowerment gap. In practice, they don't do those things. Right? In practice, kids spend most of their time in schools reading textbooks, completing worksheets, listening to lectures, etc. And they spend very, very little time doing the things that will help them build skills, build this knowledge, build this sense of motivation and efficacy, and actually practice being citizens. And we also know, unsurprisingly, that in schools that serve a predominantly poor and non-white population, students get even fewer opportunities. I'm finishing. To do these things than in schools that serve white and middle-class students. It's very, very clear that the poorer you are and the browner you are, the more likely you are sitting in rows, listening to somebody talk to you and filling out worksheets, than doing interactive things, practicing sort of civic skills and developing civic knowledge. So I'm going to skip about why I think that we should focus on the fact of segregated urban schools. So in terms of thinking about then what schools might do, this is a really bizarre one, but clearly raising educational level is huge, right? So in part, just reducing dropout rates will make a huge difference. Second of all, we should actually spend more time on civics. We have kids take English every single day, every single year for 13 years. They do the same with math. They're now increasingly doing the same with science from the upper grades. We don't often do that for civics. It's just crazy. right? And they don't practice civics even as much as they practice baseball. We should have them actually practicing civics. We should build on their own understandings of the world. I should not have been as taken aback as I was on September 11th, but I also, as a teacher, should have had the capacity to build on that in some way, and to know where they were and think about how do I get them from there to being empowered, engaged citizens. We should provide them civic experiences and then also help teachers be empowered, because teachers, in fact, are some of the most disempowered people out there, I think, being at the receiving end of mandates, and it's going to be very hard for them to help their students overcome the civic empowerment gap unless they themselves develop a sense of civic power.
All right, thank you very much, Meira. Let me turn over